This channel is 1,000 subscribers away from something big. Be here when it happens. Hit subscribe. A pickaxe strikes stone 11 feet under a wheat field outside Kazanlak, Bulgaria, and gold flashes back at the archaeologist holding it. Underneath, a burial mask, hammered thin enough to fold, resting where a face used to be. Beside it, 2 horses, buried whole, legs folded like they were told to lie down and wait. No name carved anywhere, no inscription, nothing but gold, bone, and dirt that hasn't been disturbed in over 2,000 years. This valley alone holds more than 1,500 of these mounds. Locals call them mogili, left behind by a warrior culture that controlled the Eastern Balkans for 5 millennia before Rome finally absorbed it whole. Every textbook has a word for what happened next. Assimilated. It's a clean word, a polite word, the kind of word a historian reaches for when gone feels too final to write down in an academic paper. But what if assimilated was the wrong word from the start? What if this population never actually left, and the only thing standing between you and a direct genetic line to them is a cheek swab and 20 minutes? If a people's language, their religion, and even their name can disappear inside a single generation of conquest, how much of them is actually gone? The people who built those mounds are usually called Thracians, an Indo-European culture that held this stretch of southeastern Europe for roughly 5,000 years. Known to us mostly through Greek and Roman writers rather than their own records, since almost nothing of their written language survived. That's the accepted starting point. Warriors, gold workers, horse breeders, absorbed by empire, end of story. Except for one number that never quite added up. Roman sources describe the Thracian and Dacian wars as close to total. Military campaigns brutal enough to break the region's independence for good, followed by forced resettlement of entire communities. That's the official record, and yet burial practices in these exact valleys barely changed for another 200 years afterward. You'd expect a shattered population to bury its dead differently, or stop burying them the old way entirely. It didn't. The standard narrative moves past that detail quickly. By the 2nd and 3rd century AD, Thracian identity gets folded into Roman provincial life. Latin arrives, and centuries later, Slavic languages arrive on top of that. Local gods get renamed to fit a Roman pantheon. Tribal names stop appearing on inscriptions almost entirely, as though someone reached into the record and edited them out. Here's the harder number, though. Some of those same extinguished burial mounds were being reused, reopened, rededicated, added to, by local families for generations after the culture that built them was supposedly finished. Nobody told the people actually living in that valley that their identity had ended. They kept burying their dead in the same ground, using the same customs, long after the name for what they were had already vanished from official use. So if the population didn't move, and the customs didn't stop, what, exactly, vanished? Here's where it gets complicated. In 2019, a biologist named Alessandro Modi, working out of the University of Florence alongside Desislava Nesheva and Sena Karachanak-Yankova at the Medical University of Sofia, published something that hadn't existed before. Complete mitochondrial genomes. Think of it as the genetic paper trail passed down strictly through mothers, generation after generation, largely untouched by the mixing that happens on the paternal side, recovered from 25 individuals buried in 3 separate Bronze Age necropolises in Bulgaria. Shakerja Mogila, Gabrova Mogila, Bereketska Mogila, all dated to the 2nd or 3rd millennium BC. These were among the first complete ancient mitochondrial genomes ever pulled from Thracian-associated burial ground, addressing a population whose origins researchers had argued over for decades without this kind of direct evidence. The finding that actually mattered wasn't a single dramatic mutation, it was positioning. The maternal DNA placed these Bronze Age individuals in an intermediate genetic position, sitting directly between the earliest Neolithic farming populations and the steppe-descended groups that arrived later in the Bronze Age. Not a pure bloodline waiting quietly to be wiped out by history, a crossroads population. Already blended, already absorbing outside lineages, centuries before Rome ever marched into the region. You'd expect a population that gets called assimilated by every history book to have started out as something singular, one bloodline, easily erased once conquest came. You'd be wrong. The settled story from a moment ago assumed Thracian identity was fragile precisely because it was supposedly pure. The genetic record says the opposite. This was a population built from mixture from the very beginning. And mixed populations don't erase cleanly. They tend to do something else entirely. They persist quietly, folded into whoever comes next, rather than disappearing with whoever came before. Not by accident, by architecture. Earlier research had already been circling this same conclusion from a different angle. A 2015 study, also led by Nashiva, examined mitochondrial DNA from Proto-Bulgarian burial sites dated to the 8th through 10th century AD, populations that historians had long assumed were essentially foreign newcomers. A Turkic-speaking people arriving wholesale from Central Asia with little connection to whoever came before them. That study instead found a Western Eurasian genetic origin sitting underneath the supposedly foreign population, undercutting the tidy idea that later arrivals simply erased what existed before them and started fresh. Add to that a 2018 paper in Nature where geneticist Ian Mathieson and his colleagues mapped ancient genomes across southeastern Europe at a much larger scale, tracing how Iron Age Balkan populations connect genetically both backward, to Bronze Age groups like the ones in the Modi study, and forward, into populations that came after. Researchers working with this data are careful to frame it as evidence of probability and pattern, not as absolute proof of an unbroken line for any single named group. The genetic record shows continuity is plausible and repeatedly observed. Not that every individual mound builder has a documented descendant alive today. So the anomaly here was never one smoking gun gene sitting in a single sample. It's a pattern, repeating across independent studies decades apart. Correspondence analysis in the 2019 research showed the Thracian maternal gene pool was genetically distinct from both the hunter-gatherers who came before and the steppe pastoralists who arrived alongside them. Its own signature, sitting at what researchers describe as a genetic gateway linking Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean. If that signature was already this stable a full 1,000 years before a single Roman legion crossed into the region, what would it actually take to erase it completely? Maybe nothing ever did. Sena Karachanak-Yankova's team at the Medical University of Sofia, the same institution behind the maternal research, has spent years running a parallel investigation, this time down the paternal line. Y-chromosome DNA, passed almost exclusively from father to son, works like a second independent record book, one that rarely gets edited by the maternal side at all. And one particular marker keeps showing up at unusually high frequency across the region. Haplogroup I2A. Think of a haplogroup as a genetic surname, a marker that tracks one branch of ancestry back through an unbroken line of fathers, a lineage tied to pre-Slavic Balkan populations rather than the Slavic-speaking migrations that arrived centuries later. Researchers studying this pattern describe it cautiously, as a statistical signal worth investigating rather than a settled fact carved in stone. The mainstream reading of that signal is straightforward enough. Deep, largely uninterrupted continuity in the male population of the Eastern Balkans, reaching back to a period before Thracian identity was even being written about by outside observers. Bedrock that every later arrival, Roman, Slavic, Ottoman, simply built on top of rather than replacing outright. But that reading has a limit, and it's a real one. Y-chromosome data alone can't account for the cultural erasure that unquestionably did happen. The language disappeared, the religion disappeared. The script disappeared almost entirely. A lineage surviving quietly in the blood doesn't prove the culture survived alongside it, and haplogroup frequency can shift over 2,000 years through founder effects and simple genetic drift, not only through an unbroken line of descent. It's suggestive. It isn't proof by itself, and there's a specific number worth sitting with here. By some estimates, at least 3 separate major population movements, Roman, Slavic, and later Ottoman-era migration, passed directly through this exact stretch of the Balkans within a window of roughly 1,500 years. 3 waves. 3 chances for a population, and its lineage, to be genuinely overwritten. A Y-chromosome lineage surviving that gauntlet explains the men. It says nothing about a second, far more complicated pattern researchers found sitting on the maternal side of the same story. One that points somewhere almost nobody expected to look. That second, more complicated pattern has a name attached to it, and a paper. Iosif Lazaridis, a population geneticist working inside David Reich's ancient DNA lab at Harvard Medical School, co-led a 2022 project researchers now call the Southern Arc, a large-scale survey of ancient genomes spanning Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Balkans across several thousand years. Work coming out of that project has pushed some researchers toward a reading of the maternal data that doesn't sit comfortably next to the Y-chromosome story at all. Here's the contested piece. Some researchers argue the maternal continuity found in the Modi and Nesheva research reflects something more specific than the population stayed. It reflects women staying rooted in place across successive waves of conquest, far more than men did. That pattern isn't unique to this valley. Across ancient Europe, invading and migrating populations tended to skew disproportionately male, soldiers and settlers rather than whole communities, which meant local maternal lineages often persisted underneath a surface culture and a ruling class that kept changing on top of them. You'd expect both sides of the genome to tell the same story about who stayed. You'd be wrong. If that reading holds, the uninterrupted Y-chromosome bedrock from a moment ago stops meaning what it sounded like it meant. It's not proof of an unbroken Thracian population sitting quietly under 2,000 years of empire. It could just as easily be proof that the men were largely replaced, killed, displaced, outcompeted by incoming male lineages, while the women's lineages quietly carried the older signature forward regardless of who was doing the conquering. Two theories, two different halves of the same genome, and they don't agree on who actually stayed. Picture a woman in a Balkan village sometime in the 3rd century AD, standing at the edge of a market square where a language she doesn't fully recognize has started replacing the one she grew up speaking. She still walks the same path to bury her dead the way her mother did, and her mother's mother. Nobody is asking her what she calls herself. Her bones, one day, would still answer the question anyway. There's a specific number sitting underneath all of this that makes it harder to wave off as coincidence. The 2019 study's 25 sampled genomes come from 3 necropolises separated by hundreds of kilometers, and they still cluster together genetically, tightly enough to register as one population rather than 3 unrelated ones. Small sample, consistent signal, which raises an explanation almost nobody wants to say out loud in a peer-reviewed paper. Here is where it gets uncomfortable. Some researchers working in Balkan population genetics have started noting, carefully, that identity and biology can diverge so completely after conquest that a population can be genetically continuous and culturally extinct at the exact same time, with almost no contradiction between those two facts sitting side by side in the same set of records. Sit with what that actually means for a second. If Thracian maternal lineages, and a meaningful share of the paternal ones too, really did persist this cleanly through Roman rule, then Slavic migration, then Ottoman administration, 3 entirely different empires, 3 entirely different official languages, then cultural extinction may not describe a biological event at all. It may just mean the paperwork changed, the tax rolls changed, the word ascribe reached for changed. That's a colder, more uncomfortable reframe than a people disappeared. And it's worth noticing that it's the harder one to prove and the harder one to fully believe, precisely because it makes extinction sound almost bureaucratic. Researchers raising this idea are careful to frame it as an interpretation, not a measured statistic. It's an argument about what identity means, built on top of genetic data that itself only shows patterns and probabilities, not certainties about any single family line. Different researchers, looking at the same numbers, would draw the ethical and definitional line in different places. Which brings this back to the ground, literally. Picture the edge of the Kazanlak Valley at first light. Mist still pooled in the low ground between more than 1,000 burial mounds, most of them still unopened. Step down into a chamber built like the Kazanlak tomb, and the air turns immediately colder, stone damp, closed off from 2,000 years of weather outside. Torchlight would have caught the gold leaf of a burial mask the same way a headlamp catches it now. Not symbolically, but literally. The same metal, the same reflective angle. Decoration meant for a funeral procession that actually happened. For a specific dead man, on a specific day. Beside the human remains, horse bones, buried whole, an actual offering rather than a decorative flourish. Archaeologists have taken to calling this stretch of ground the Valley of the Thracian Kings. The same river system, the same soil, occupied for well over 2,000 years by people whose blood, if the genetic pattern holds, may never have actually left this valley at all. Here's the reframe that changes what this entire investigation has been about. This was never really a mystery about a vanished people. It's a mystery about a vanished word. Thracian stopped appearing on inscriptions. It stopped being spoken as a living identity, claimed out loud by anyone describing themselves. But the population that word once described didn't need to go anywhere, because there was nowhere else for a rooted agricultural, mining, mountain valley population to go. You don't migrate away from your own farmland because an empire renamed your province. And the genetic record backs this from 2 directions at once, independently. Modi and her colleagues' maternal data shows continuity reaching back through the Bronze Age, sitting underneath every later layer of migration and conquest. Separately, modern Y-chromosome surveys point to a still detectable pre-Slavic paternal signature sitting in that same geographic footprint, run by a different lab, using an entirely different method, decades apart from the mitochondrial work. Two independent lines of evidence converging on the same unglamorous, almost administrative conclusion. Whatever disappeared here, it wasn't biological. It was bureaucratic, gone, only on paper. So when a modern Bulgarian, Macedonian, or Turkish person takes a commercial DNA test and gets a result back with no mention of Thracian anywhere on the page, it's worth asking what that blank space actually means. It doesn't mean the lineage isn't sitting there in the data. It means no company selling ancestry results has built a category for a people that history simply stopped writing about. The DNA didn't fail to survive 2,000 years of empire, migration, and administrative renaming. The label did. None of this is unique to one gold-buried valley in Bulgaria. Nearly every vanished ancient people named in a textbook, Etruscans, Iberians, dozens of others scattered across the ancient world, vanished the exact same administrative way, as a word, a language, a name dropped from a treaty or a tax record, while the actual population kept living, farming, and burying its dead in the same ground it always had. Somewhere, a researcher is looking at another supposedly extinct people's genome and finding the exact same pattern this valley just gave up. What that leaves is a genuinely uncomfortable question about where any of us draw the line between ancestor and extinct civilization. Researchers studying population continuity are careful to note this line is drawn by historians and record keepers, not by biology. Biology rarely erases as cleanly, or as conveniently, as a change in official language suggests it should. Sometimes the distance between your direct ancestors and a vanished people isn't deep antiquity at all. It's a few dozen generations, a number small enough to fit on one family tree, if anyone had bothered to keep drawing it past the point an empire stopped writing the name down. A river doesn't disappear when a new map stops labeling it. It just keeps running under whatever name gets written on the bank that year, indifferent to the label, carrying the same water it always did. The Thracians never actually vanished, they just stopped being asked about. And somewhere in a lab right now, a sample from an unmarked mound is waiting to be asked again.